The candles at Lady Penhaligon's supper had burned low by the time Duchess Agatha Harnwick decided to make use of the evening. 22 guests stood in the warm disorder that follows a concluded meal, silk rustling, glassware catching the last of the light, voices overlapping in the way voices do when no one yet wishes to be the first to withdraw. Mariel Thorne stood near the window with Philippa Penhaligon, whose life she had saved in July and who had not forgotten it. And the two women were deep in a conversation that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with Philippa's recovery. Muriel was 26 years old, the daughter of a dead herbalist, and she was laughing at something Philippa had said, a real laugh, quiet and sudden. When Duchess Agatha turned to her son near the fire and spoke in the carrying pitch he had cultivated across 30 years of marble rooms, Tiberius Harnwick, Duke of Rothwell, was 38, and he had been standing beside his mother for 20 minutes with the tolerant stillness of a man who has learned that the fastest route through an evening is to offer no resistance to it. He heard his mother's voice at his shoulder, low and precise as a key finding its lock. "Tiberius, look at her. Apothecary's girl. I cannot think what Lady Penhaligon was about." He did not look immediately. He lifted his glass instead. "Mother, she did save Philippa." The Duchess made a small sound that was not agreement. "Say what you think of her, Tiberius." And there it was, the sentence that had been planted in him so long ago he had long since mistaken it for his own soil. He was conditioned, and he was irritated. And he was 38 years old and still unable, in a room full of people, to cross the woman he believed was the source of everything he knew. He turned. He saw Mariel Thorne, the laugh still fading from her face, her attention still half with Philippa. And 6 words rose in him as though they had always been there waiting. And he spoke them at a volume that reached 6 guests within 8 feet of him. "My mother was twice the woman she will ever be." The room went still. Lady Penhaligon's niece made a small, involuntary sound. Mr. Corbin Mewis, standing 3 feet to Mariel's left, with a glass of claret he had barely touched, set it down on the nearest surface without looking at it. And Mariel Thorne did not flinch. She looked at the Duke. Not with anger. The word for what crossed her face was something closer to the attention a physician gives a symptom she has not yet classified. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, and then she answered him at exactly his volume. Not louder, not softer. The same pitch, the same carrying quality, the same marble room working for both of them equally. And she raised half the man I deserve. The candelabrum on the side table flickered as though the room had exhaled. Someone inhaled sharply. Lady Penhaligon, standing 10 feet away with her hands clasped at her waist, closed her eyes for one moment and then opened them with the expression of a woman who was already composing tomorrow's account of this evening for her sister in Bath. Mariel turned back to Philippa and resumed their conversation as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Her voice, when she spoke to Philippa, was the same voice it had been 30 seconds earlier. She asked about the tincture she had left with the housekeeper, and whether the morning dosage had agreed with Philippa's digestion. And Philippa, pale but composed, because Philippa had been taught by Mariel's example over the past 3 months that composure was a form of armor, answered her. Tiberius stood where he was. In 38 years, no one had spoken to him as a man rather than a rank. The person who had just done it was a woman he had been raised to consider beneath his notice, and she had already returned her notice to someone else, which was worse than anything she might have said in addition. He looked at his mother. Duchess Agatha's face had closed. Not in satisfaction, he registered, but in the specific discomfort of a woman who has transmitted a sentence and felt it answered in a way she had not prepared for. He studied that expression for 3 full seconds, and something in him that had no name, yet shifted 1 degree from where it had always stood. On the carriage ride home through the dark Cornish lanes, with the wheels on the road and the smell of November coming through the window seams, his mother made one pleased remark about the matter being settled. Tiberius looked at the passing dark and said nothing. He was not certain what had been settled, and he was not certain the uncertainty was new. The following morning, Mariel arrived at Mewes's apothecary on the Pendraven High Street before Mr. Mewes, as she did most mornings, and let herself in with her own key and lit the lamp above the dispensing counter and began the day. The shop smelled of dried valerian and beeswax, and the faint mineral sharpness of the mortar stone. And she had loved that smell since she was 11 years old, and her mother had first brought her here to collect a preparation for a patient who lived beyond walking distance. She was grinding a fresh batch of dried feverfew when she heard the bell above the door and looked up to find Mrs. Penrose's granddaughter, 14 and grave-faced, holding a note requesting the usual preparation for Mrs. Penrose's joints before the cold settled in properly. Muriel filled it from her mother's formula, written in Eulalia Thorne's small, precise hand in the notation ledger that lived on the second shelf, and wrapped it in brown paper and sent the girl off with instructions about the morning dose. She was consulting the ledger for a second preparation when she heard the front bell again. And this time, it was her Aunt Phoebe, who came in twice a week to collect her letters and write her replies at the small table in the back room. Because Phoebe's sight had deteriorated to the point where writing at home required more light than the cottage windows allowed before midday. Phoebe settled herself at the table with her correspondence and was quiet for several minutes while Mariel worked. And then Phoebe said, "There is a letter here from Mrs. Carow in St. Austell, and I shall read you the relevant portion because I think you ought to hear it." Phoebe's voice was even. She had learned evenness from her sister Eulalia, who had learned it from necessity. She read, "I understand from Mrs. Penrose that your niece continues at Mewes's establishment, despite the understanding in this district of what her mother was. I mention it only because I have heard that Miss Thorne has recently been at Penhaligon Park in a professional capacity, and I would not wish the Penhaligons to be misled about the family's history of false practice." Phoebe set the letter down and looked at Mariel. Mariel set down the pestle. "Mrs. Carow has believed that for 12 years, she said. She will believe it for 12 more, unless something changes." "Something must change," Phoebe said. "I went to the lending library on Thursday, and Mrs. Veal would not meet my eyes." Mariel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." Mr. Mewes arrived at 9:30, shaking rain from his coat, and set his bag on the counter with the particular heaviness of a man carrying news he has not decided how to deliver. He was 54 years old, and had been Eulalia Thorne's apprentice before he had his own shop, and he had never, in Mariel's memory, spoken easily about what had happened to Eulalia in her last 2 years. "The Trevanion family have sent a note," he said without preamble. "They will not be sending for you directly. They wish to deal with me, or not at all." Mariel did not look up from the preparation she was labeling. "That is the third this autumn." "It is." Mr. Mewes took off his coat. "I had a word with old Mr. Rowe at the market on Tuesday. He remembers when it began. Your mother's practice, the accusation. He says it came from Rothwell Hall. He always knew that much. But he could never say which person in that household." He paused. Neither could I. Mariel sealed the label with a small press of her thumb. "Do you know if it was the Duchess herself, or someone she instructed?" "I do not know," Mr. Mewes said. "I have never known. I know only that the letter to the magistrate in 1820 came from that direction, and that after it came, your mother spent 2 years watching her practice die around her, and that she was dead herself by 1822. Marielle nodded once. Mr. Mewis went to the back room. She could hear him moving about, preparing the morning's work, and the sound of the rain on the window was steady and ordinary. And she stood at the counter for a moment, with her hands still on the labeled preparation. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and took out a letter. It was already written, already addressed, in her own hand, to a Mr. Linus Quellen, solicitor, of Truro. She had written it in September, after she had saved Philippa Penhaligon's life, and understood for the first time that she now had a witness who would speak for her character. She had been carrying it for 3 weeks, waiting to be certain. She was certain now. She took the small stick of sealing wax from the counter drawer and held it over the lamp flame and pressed her seal into the soft red circle. And then she set the letter with the outgoing post and returned to her grinding. The Tuesday following the supper, Tiberius Harnwick rode into Pendraven on what he told himself was an errand. He needed willow bark. His head ached. These were not precisely lies. He had, in fact, a low, persistent headache that had been with him since the carriage ride home from Penhaligon Park, and willow bark would address it. And he had never in his life purchased willow bark at Mew's Apothecary, because he had never in his life entered Mew's Apothecary. He tied his horse at the post outside and went in. The bell above the door announced him, and Mariel Thorne looked up from the counter. She registered who he was in the first instant, and her expression did not change. Not warmer, not cooler, not the particular careful blankness that people adopted in his presence when they were deciding how much to defer. She looked at him as she looked at every customer who came through the door. "Good morning," she said. "What can I prepare for you?" "Willow bark," Tiberius said, "for a headache." She turned, measured, wrapped the preparation in brown paper with the efficiency of someone who has done this particular task several hundred times, and set it on the counter with a brief explanation of the correct quantity and the inadvisability of taking it on an empty stomach. 3 shillings 6pence, she said. He paid. Their hands met for 2 seconds over the coins on the counter, his gloved, hers not. And he pulled back first, and she did not acknowledge it. And he picked up the packet and walked out with the distinct and slightly disorienting sense that he had just been treated as a man rather than a rank. She had not been rude. She had not been warm. She had been precise and civil, and had offered him exactly what he had asked for and nothing else. And no one in his adult life had managed that particular calibration. He mounted his horse and rode out of Pendraven, and the headache, which had been real, eased somewhat by the time he reached the Rothwell Lane. In the shop, Mr. Mewes emerged from the back room and came to stand beside Marielle at the counter. He looked at the door through which the Duke had just departed. "Miss Thorne," he said, "do you know who that was?" "I know, Mr. Mewes," Marielle said. Mr. Mewes considered this. He paid 3 shillings 6pence for willow bark and did not flinch at the price. "No," Marielle agreed. "He'll be back." He was back the following Tuesday, asking for dried feverfew. The Tuesday after that, he came for a preparation for a tenant's chest complaint, and Marielle gave him the formula and the instructions, and did not ask how the tenant was, because that was not the transaction he had described. The Tuesday after that, the 4th visit, he came with a genuine question about valerian dosage, and she answered it directly. And when his answer was based on a misconception about the concentration at which the herb became ineffective, she told him so without softening the correction or apologizing for it. The concentration you are describing would produce the effect you want in perhaps a quarter of patients, she said. In the remainder, it would do very little. The effective threshold is higher than most household references suggest. Tiberius looked at her. Where did you learn that? From my mother's notation ledger, Mariel said. She kept records of every preparation and every patient outcome for 19 years. It is the most comprehensive record of herbal efficacy in this part of Cornwall, and it lives on that shelf. She nodded toward the second shelf without looking at it. Mr. Mewes uses it as his primary reference. Tiberius glanced at the ledger. He did not say anything further about it that day, but he lingered at the counter past the transaction's natural end, asking about the feverfew he had purchased 2 weeks earlier and whether the preparation had been correctly stored. And Mariel answered him and did not encourage the lingering and did not discourage it either. Outside in the district, the Tuesday visits had begun to be noticed. The rumor that reached Lady Penhaligon's drawing room by the 3rd week was that Mariel Thorne had been receiving the Duke of Rothwell's regular custom and might be pursuing some form of claim against the Harnwick household. 2 families who had recently begun sending for Mariel directly, the Roseveres of Trevenna and the Belitho family at the mill, stopped doing so without explanation. And on a wet Friday morning, Mr. Mewes found a note slipped under the shop door suggesting that a reputable apothecary ought to reconsider the character of his assistant before the district drew its own conclusions. Mr. Mewes read the note and then burned it in the small grate in the back room and told Mariel only that there had been a note and that he had dealt with it. What did it say? Mariel asked. Nothing that merited keeping, Mr. Mewes said. Are you all right, Miss Thorne? Yes, she said. I have been all right through worse than this. She returned to the preparation she was measuring, and Mr. Mewes looked at her for a moment and then went back to his work. Because he had known Eulalia Thorne's daughter long enough to understand that the steadiness was real and not a performance, and that the steadiness was also, sometimes, the most heartbreaking thing about her. On the 6th Tuesday, rain came in off the sea and struck the mullioned window of the apothecary with the particular persistence of a November storm that intends to stay. Mr. Mewes had ridden out at midday to attend to a tenant's family at the far edge of the Pendraven Farms, and Mariel was alone at the counter, grinding dried valerian, when the bell above the door announced Tiberius Harnwick. He was wet across the shoulders. He had not this time prepared a pretext. He stood at the counter and looked at the preparation she was working on and then looked at her. Miss Thorne, he said, I must ask you directly. You have treated me with perfect civility across 6 visits. You have not once referred to what was said at Lady Penhaligon's supper. I should like to know why. Mariel set the pestle down on the stone. She looked at him with the same diagnostic attention she had turned on him across the candlelit salon, and when she spoke to the specific question he had asked. Because, Your Grace, I have lived 26 years in this district, she said, and I have observed that a man's cruelty is almost always a line someone else wrote for him. I do not yet know who wrote yours. When I know, I shall decide whether to be angry with you or with them. Until then, I serve you because Mr. Mewes would have reasonable grounds to dismiss me if I were rude to a duke for a reason I could not articulate in plain English. Tiberius was quiet for a moment. You assume someone wrote it? I calculate, Your Grace, Mariel said. I do not believe you are cruel as a matter of character. I believe you are a man who has repeated a sentence without examining it. If you examine it and find you still believe it, then I shall be angry with you specifically, and I shall still serve you, because that is my employment, and we shall not speak outside the bounds of this counter. If you examine it and find otherwise, then you and I have a different conversation at some later point." She picked up the pestle again and then set it down once more, because there was something else to be said, and she had decided to say it. "I am not a project, Your Grace. I am a woman grinding valerian root on a Tuesday afternoon. Whatever sentence you have been given, examine it at your own desk, not at mine. Come back when you have either an apology or a headache, or both." The smallest, most involuntary thing crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but something in the register of a man recognizing for the first time that he has met his match and finding the recognition more clarifying than uncomfortable. He paid for the preparation. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. "Miss Thorne," he said, "I believe I shall examine the sentence." "Good," she said. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." He rode directly to Rothwell Hall and went to his father's writing room, which had been locked since his father's death 9 years ago, and which smelled, when he opened it, of old paper and the particular cold of a room that has been sealed against the living. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he crossed to the writing desk and unlocked it with the key he had carried on his watch chain for 9 years and never used. He read for 3 hours. He found, in the third drawer, a letter addressed in a woman's hand to Lord Nethercote. Not to the Duchess, as he had always believed. And he read it twice and set it aside. He found, in the margin of a document he did not immediately recognize, his father's handwriting. "Nethercote has overreached. Agatha complied. I shall not." He found, in the bottom drawer, a draft addressed to the Pendraven magistrate in his father's hand, retracting an accusation against Mrs. Eulalia Thorne of Pendraven. Incomplete, unfinished, the ink dry for 9 years. At 8 o'clock that evening, he took a fresh sheet of paper and wrote at the top, in his own hand, "My uncle is wrong. My mother complied." He sat at his dead father's desk and wrote underneath it, for 3 hours, everything the documents told him, setting it out as evidence rather than as feeling, because his mind was the instrument he most trusted, and this was the work that instrument was built to do. 2 days later, Lord Nethercote's carriage arrived unannounced at Rothwell Hall. Percival, Lord Nethercote, was 71 years old, and had been the most politically effective man in the Hampshire district for 4 decades. And he walked into Tiberius's study with the ease of a man who has never in his life been refused entry anywhere. He was tall, still, with the kind of face that had been handsome in youth and had settled into authority, and he looked at his nephew with the expression of a man who expects the conversation to be brief. "I am told," Nethercote said, "that you have been riding into Pendraven on Tuesdays and purchasing preparations at the apothecary's shop." "That is correct," Tiberius said. "You will cease," Nethercote said. "The Thorne woman is building a case. She has a solicitor in Truro. Your attendance at her counter is being read in this district as an endorsement of her claim, and I will not have the Harnwick name attached to whatever she intends." Tiberius stood up from behind his desk. He was not a small man, and he was standing now in his father's study, which was also his study, and the documents in his father's writing room were locked again behind him. And he looked at his uncle for a long moment before he spoke. He said it plainly. "No." Nethercote blinked. "I beg your pardon." "I will not cease," Tiberius said. "I have read my father's papers, uncle. I know what he found and what he intended to do about it. I know what you instructed my mother to do in 1820 and why. And I know that my father knew it and was prevented from acting only by dying before he could. I will not cease my visits to Pendraven, and I will not pretend that the documents in that desk do not exist." The silence in the room was the kind that precedes a significant alteration in the landscape. Nethercoat's face went through several things in quick succession, and what it settled on was the cold fury of a man who has never, in 71 years, encountered a refusal from this particular direction. "You are making," Nethercoat said quietly, "a very serious error." "I am correcting one," Tiberius said. "I should like you to leave my house now, Uncle." Nethercoat left. Tiberius stood at the window and watched the carriage go down the drive, and then he went to his writing table and wrote a letter to Mr. Linus Quellen of Truro, requesting a meeting at the solicitor's earliest convenience and offering documentary testimony in connection with any inquiry touching the name of Mrs. Eulalia Thorne. Quellen's reply arrived within the week. Tiberius read it at his breakfast table on a cold November morning, and then read it again. The petition, Quellen wrote, was already filed. It had been in preparation since the previous July. Miss Thorne had engaged him the week after she saved Lady Penhaligon's niece, when she had understood that she had, for the first time, a witness of sufficient standing to make the thing possible. His Grace was welcome to offer testimony, and his documentary evidence would be of considerable value to the case. But he should understand that he was walking into a proceeding that Miss Thorne had built entirely without him over 4 months in silence, while the district believed what it believed about her. Tiberius set the letter down. He looked at the window for a while. Then he wrote back to Quellen, accepting the invitation and confirming his testimony. Nethercoat's next move came through the Truro Gazette. An anonymous letter appeared in the correspondence column alleging that Miss Thorne had fabricated evidence for the coroner's petition and was pursuing the case not in the interest of her mother's reputation, but in order to extract a settlement from the Harnwick estate. The letter was well written and specific enough to carry weight with readers who did not know the case. Quellen traced it within the week to Nethercoat's Hampshire stationery. A particular weight of paper, a particular watermark, a particular postal route, and filed the identification with the coroner's office, which had the effect of strengthening the petition's standing rather than weakening it. Because a man who writes anonymously to a newspaper about a pending coroner's case reveals the nature of his interest in the outcome. That same week, Nethercoat sent a summons to Rothwell Hall, instructing Tiberius to present himself in Hampshire. Tiberius did not go. Instead, that same evening, he went to the Rothwell Library, where his mother sat with her needlework by the lamp, and he closed the door behind him and stood in front of her chair and asked her, in a voice that was entirely level, who had dictated the letter to the Pendraven magistrate in 1820. Duchess Agatha set down her needlework. She looked at her son, and something in her face, something that had been held in place for a very long time, shifted. She wept once, briefly, and then she stopped and looked at her hands. "Percy dictated it," she said. "He told me what to write, and I wrote it. He told me which household servant to instruct to deliver it, and I instructed her. He said the woman had refused to attend Cousin Beatty's lying-in twice, and that Beatty had died, and that he would not have the Thorne woman's refusal questioned or examined." She stopped. "Your father found out. He was very angry. He said he would write to the magistrate and correct it. And then he was dead within the month, and Percy came to manage everything, and I—" She stopped again. "I did not have the means, Tiberius, to refuse Percy. I have not had those means since I was 9 years old." "Did you know," Tiberius said, "that Mrs. Thorne died 2 years later?" Agatha looked at her hands. "I heard so," she said. "Yes. And her daughter has been living in this district for 12 years with your brother's slander still attached to her mother's name," Tiberius said. "She has been polite to people who still believe it. She has built a practice on the edges of what she is permitted to do, and she has supported her aunt on what that practice earns, And she has done it all while knowing the accusation came from this house and not knowing which person in this house was responsible. Agatha said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you want from me, Tiberius?" "I want you to speak to Mr. Quellen privately," Tiberius said. "I am not asking you to testify in court. I am asking you to confirm what you have told me. To a solicitor, in a room with no one present but the two of you and a clerk. That is all." Agatha looked at her needlework, which lay in her lap like something abandoned. "And Percy?" "Percy dictated the letter," Tiberius said. "I intend to say so on the record. I will say that you transmitted it because you had obeyed your brother since childhood and did not, in 1820, possess the means to refuse him. That is the truth, and it is what I will say." Agatha was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I will speak to Mr. Quellen." Tiberius walked out of the library and stood in the corridor for a moment with his back against the closed door. Then he put on his coat and rode out into the November dark toward Pendraven. The following week, walking back from a tenant cottage on the Rothwell land, he came up alongside Marielle on the lane. She was returning from a call at the Trevenna farm, her bag over one arm, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. And they walked together for a quarter mile without arranging to do so. At the stile in the stone wall where the lane crossed into the Rothwell fields, he stopped and offered her his hand, not his arm, his hand, palm out, to help her across the stone step. She looked at the hand for 1 second. Then she took it, gloved palm to his gloved palm, and stepped across the stile, 4 seconds, and released it. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "Tiberius," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Not yet," she said. "But soon." She walked on down the lane toward Pendraven, and he stood at the stile and watched her go, and the November afternoon was cold and clear and entirely ordinary. And something in his chest had not been ordinary for weeks. The night before the Truro inquest, Aunt Phoebe went to bed at 9 o'clock, and the fire in the Rose Cottage parlor burned low, and Marielle sat at the small table with her papers spread around her. Mr. Quellen's instructions, her mother's clinical notes copied in her own hand for the court, the list of witnesses, and their expected testimonies. Tiberius sat in the facing chair, which was too small for him and which he occupied anyway. And the room was quiet, except for the fire and the sound of the wind finding the gaps in the window frames. Marielle looked up from the papers and looked at him directly. "Do you understand what testifying will cost you?" she said. He answered without hesitation, "Yes." "I want you to be specific," she said. "Not in general. In particular. You will be the Duke who stood in a coroner's court and named his living uncle as the author of a false accusation. Lord Nethercoat's family will not forgive it. His political allies will not forgive it. You will carry that in this district and in Hampshire for the rest of your life, and there will be people who decide that a man who testifies against his own family cannot be trusted by anyone." Tiberius looked at the fire. "I know that," he said. "Are you certain?" Marielle said. "Because I need you to be certain before tomorrow morning, not after." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have recited my uncle's sentences for 31 years. I thought they were my mother's. I thought they were mine. I have repeated them in rooms full of people, and I have never once examined them, because the man who put them in me was the cleverest man I knew, and I had no reason to doubt that his cleverness was in my interest." He paused. "I would rather carry the truth for the 30 years I have left than carry one more day of a doctrine that destroyed a woman's life and her daughter's prospects, and is still, tonight, being believed by families in this district who will not send for you because of a letter my uncle wrote and my mother transmitted, and my father died, before he could correct. He looked at her. "I am entirely certain." Marielle set down her pen. She was quiet for 3 seconds, and then she pushed back her chair and crossed the room and knelt beside his chair. Not as a gesture of submission, but as the most direct route to being at his level. She took his right hand in both of hers and turned it over and closed his fingers around hers and held it. 1 minute, by the clock on the mantelpiece. "Thank you," she said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the coroner decides, whatever the district says afterward, thank you for what you have already done." She rose. She returned to her papers. She did not look up again. Tiberius did not move his hand for a long time. He sat in the small chair by the low fire and listened to the wind at the windows and the scratch of her pen. And outside in the district, the rumor that Mariel Thorne was using the petition to extort the Harnwicks was at its loudest point. A church warden had written to Mr. Muse 2 families had removed their custom from the shop entirely, and Aunt Phoebe had stopped going to the lending library because of what was said there when she came in. Marielle knew all of it. She had said nothing publicly. She had simply continued to grind her preparations and answer her letters and build her case. And the inquest was 6 hours away, and she was still working. The Truro Coroner's Court sat on the first Thursday of December at 9:30 in the morning. Frost lay on the flagstones outside and on the iron railings and on the bare branches of the elm trees in the courthouse square. 70 people filled the public benches, merchants, gentry, working families from Pendraven and the surrounding parishes, several people who had known Eulalia Thorne, and several more who had known only the accusation. Mr. Quellen presented the case in measured, precise language. Mr. Corbin Muse testified first, explaining in plain terms the herbal concentration named in the 1820 accusation and why it was, to any trained practitioner, an impossibility. The quantity described would have been visible, would have had a taste, would have been identified immediately by the attending physician, Mrs. Honora Kello, who had been an undercook at Rothwell Hall in 1820 and had left the household service the following year, testified to overhearing, through a partially open door, the dictation of a letter. A woman's voice and a man's voice, the man's voice directing, the woman's voice reading it back. Then Marielle stood and read from her mother's clinical notes on the case that had originated everything. She read in a steady voice that did not waver and did not perform. She read as a woman who has spent 4 months preparing to do exactly this, and has decided that the preparation is sufficient. Eulalia Thorne's notes described Mrs. Beatty Aurick's condition in July of 1820. The diagnosis Eulalia had given, the herbal preparation she had recommended, and the 2 requests she had received to attend the lying-in at the Nethercote cousins' household. Requests she had declined on the grounds that the household circumstances gave her reason to believe the lying-in might not proceed safely, and that her presence would be used to obscure rather than address the reason for that concern. She had written, in her small, precise hand, at the bottom of the entry, "I have declined twice. I believe I shall be made to answer for it." The room was very quiet. The coroner asked whether any further witness wished to speak. Mr. Quellen rose. "Your worship," he said, "His Grace the Duke of Rothwell requests leave to testify." The courtroom went still in a way that was different from the quiet that had preceded it. 70 people shifted and turned. Marielle, who was seated at the council table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, turned also. Tiberius was standing at the back of the room. He had come in quietly, sometime during Mr. Muse's testimony, and had stood there for the past hour without making himself known. He was in his riding coat, not his formal dress, and he was looking at Marielle across the full length of the room. with an expression that was not asking her permission and was not demanding it either. It was simply waiting, the way a man waits who has made his decision and is prepared to live with whatever follows from it. Mariel looked at him for 2 seconds. Then she turned to the coroner and nodded once. Tiberius walked to the front of the room. He took the oath in a clear, even voice. He reached inside his coat and produced 3 documents, which he set on the edge of the coroner's table and identified one by one. The letter addressed to Lord Nethercote in Eulalia Thorne's hand, declining the second request to attend the lying-in, his father's marginal notation in the Duke's own handwriting on the document that had accompanied the magistrate's letter, and his father's unsent draft retraction, incomplete, 9 years old. Then he spoke. "Your worship," he said. The accusation made against Mrs. Eulalia Thorne of Pendraven in 1820 was not originated by my mother. It was originated by my mother's brother, Lord Percival Nethercote of Hampshire. My mother transmitted it because she had obeyed her brother since childhood and did not, in 1820, possess the means to refuse him. My father discovered this and intended to write to the magistrate correcting the record and died before he could do so. The draft of that letter is among these documents. He paused for one moment. I have spent 31 years repeating sentences I believed were my mother's. I have said them in drawing rooms and at supper tables and in the hearing of people who relied on them to form their understanding of a woman and her family. Those sentences were my uncle's. I retract them now, in this place, on this record. He looked at the coroner, and then, briefly, at Mariel. Miss Thorne's mother was, on the evidence this court has heard today, the better practitioner by every measure this court is empowered to weigh. I insulted Miss Thorne at Lady Penhaligon's supper using a sentence of my uncle's devising. I apologize for it in this place because it is where the record is kept, and the record is what matters. He placed the papers on the coroner's table and sat down. The coroner read the documents. He conferred with his clerk in a low voice for several minutes. The room was so quiet that the sound of the frost wind against the high courthouse windows was clearly audible. The coroner looked up. "This court finds," he said, "that Mrs. Eulalia Thorne of Pendraven acted at all times within the proper bounds of her vocation. The accusation made against her in 1820 is hereby struck from the district record. This court commends Miss Thorne for the diligence and care with which she prepared this case, and His Grace the Duke of Rothwell for the candor of his testimony, given at considerable personal cost." On the frost-white flagstones outside the courthouse, in the cold December air, Tiberius waited. He did not approach the door. He stood to one side of the steps and let the spectators file past him. And several of them looked at him and said nothing, and 1 or 2 nodded, and he acknowledged them and waited. Mariel came out with Aunt Phoebe on her arm. Phoebe was weeping quietly and making no effort to conceal it, because Phoebe had known Eulalia Thorne from childhood and had waited 12 years for this morning. Mariel's face was composed in the way that faces are composed when the feeling underneath is too large to be worn on the surface safely. She saw Tiberius and stopped. She said something to Phoebe, and Phoebe released her arm and went to find Mr. Muse, who was waiting near the elm trees. Mariel walked to where Tiberius stood and stopped 4 feet from him. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Thorne," he said, "you did not tell me you would testify." "No," he said. "I did not want you to have to decide whether to accept it before you heard it. I thought you deserved to hear it first." She looked at him steadily. The frost was in the air between them, and the courthouse bells had not yet rung the hour, and the flagstones were white and cold and entirely real. "I accept your testimony," she said. "I accept the apology. I accept nothing else yet. Come to Rose Cottage in 1 week, when I have had time to decide what I want to say, and not before." He inclined his head. "Entirely, Miss Thorne," he said. She walked back to Phoebe and took her aunt's arm again, and Mr. Quellen came forward to speak with her, and Mr. Muse stood beside them with his hat in his hands, and Tiberius watched them, the small circle of people who had built this case and won it. And then he turned and walked to his horse and rode back toward Pendraven in the December cold. Lord Nethercote wrote a furious letter within the week, demanding Tiberius recant his testimony publicly and attribute the documents to forgery. Tiberius did not answer it. A second letter arrived. He did not answer that one either. A third letter, from Nethercote's solicitor, arrived at the end of the month advising Tiberius that Lord Nethercote considered all family connection severed. Tiberius wrote back to the solicitor confirming that he understood and had nothing further to add. Nethercote's Cornwall influence collapsed with a speed that surprised even Quellen, who had expected a longer fight. Several families who had aligned their political interest with the Nethercote-Hampshire connection found reasons, in January, to reconsider. The Gazette published a correction. The coroner's ruling was posted at the Pendraven Market Cross, which was where official findings were posted, and it stayed there through the winter. 3 days after the ruling, Duchess Agatha came to her son's study and knocked at the door, which she had not done in the 9 years since his father's death. She had always simply entered. He said, "Come in," and she came in and stood in front of his desk, with her hands clasped. And she did not sit down. "I was 9 years old," she said. "When Percy first told me what to say at dinner, he told me what opinions to hold and which people to be seen with and which requests to refuse and which invitations to accept. And I did as I was told because he was 12 and knew everything and I was 9 and knew nothing. And by the time I was old enough to know better, I had been doing it for so long that I had forgotten it was possible to do otherwise." She paused. "I am 66 years old, Tiberius. I should like, before I am much older, to learn what I think." Tiberius looked at his mother. He did not forgive her. The word was too simple for what had happened, and he was too honest to use it when he did not mean it. But he did not refuse her either. He said, "Come on Thursday then. We'll have tea." She came on Thursday. She came the Thursday after that. Through the winter, they built, slowly and without naming it, something that functioned as an ordinary acquaintance. Two people who shared a house and a history, and were beginning, carefully, to find out what else they shared. In April, with the Rose Cottage garden coming into its first green, Tiberius had taken to reading to Marielle on the evenings when Phoebe retired early. Medical texts, mostly, because Marielle's interest in the theoretical underpinnings of what she did practically was genuine, and he had access to a library she did not. On an April evening, he read her Connie Bear on pleurisy, because she was building a new preparation for a patient and wanted the physician's account alongside her mother's herbal record, and when they finished, she walked him back through the garden to the gate in the failing light. She stopped at the gate. He stopped beside her. "Tiberius," she said, "I am going to kiss you. I want you to know that the kiss does not answer anything. When I have the answer, I will give it to you in plain words, because that is how I give things." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. She put her right hand on the side of his jaw, the first time she had touched his face, and kissed him. Closed for a count of 4, then open, longer, while the April evening settled around them and the first star appeared above the cottage roof. His arms came up and held her at the waist. Her left hand rose to the back of his neck. When they parted, she kept her hand on his jaw a moment, and he said, "Thank you." And she said, "You're welcome. The answer is probably yes. I'll tell you in May." She told him in May, on a Tuesday, at the apothecary counter, between a preparation for Mrs. Penrose and a consultation about a tenant's cough, in 3 plain words. And Mr. Muse pretended to be entirely occupied with his work in the back room, and Tiberius paid for the preparation he had not come in for, and walked out into the May morning and stood on the Pendraven High Street for a full minute before he remembered where he had left his horse. On a Tuesday morning in June, at 11 o'clock, in Pendraven Village Church, with 22 guests gathered in the pews and the summer light coming through the old windows in long pale bars, Marielle walked in, wearing pale green, her mother's color, the color Eulalia had worn to her own wedding 30 years before. She carried a posy of the herbs her mother had grown, valerian and feverfew, and dried lavender and a sprig of mint, because Eulalia had believed that the plants you worked with ought to be present at the important moments. And Marielle had always believed what her mother believed about the plants. Aunt Phoebe sat in the front pew with Mr. Muse beside her, both of them composed in the way that people are composed when they have been waiting a long time for a thing and are slightly surprised to find themselves present when it arrives. Mrs. Kello sat in the third pew in her best shawl, which she had worn only twice before in Marielle's memory. Mr. Quellen had come from Truro and sat in the fifth pew with his hat on his knee. And in the back row, alone, in a dark dress and without her usual household attendants, sat Duchess Agatha Harnwick, at Marielle's quiet invitation, extended 3 weeks before the wedding in a note that had said only, "If you would like to come, there is a place for you." The vicar pronounced the words that had been pronounced in that church for 200 years, and Tiberius said what he was asked to say, and Marielle said what she was asked to say. And when it was done, and they turned to face the church together, Marielle looked at the 22 people gathered there, the ones who had stayed through everything, who had believed her mother and believed her, and waited for the district to catch up. And her face, for the first time in a long time, was simply open. Outside, Pendraven rang its village bells. The church rang them only for its own, for births and deaths and the marriages of people who belonged to the village, in the way that belonging can't be purchased or inherited, but only earned over years, through the accumulation of small, reliable acts. The village had considered the matter through the winter and arrived at a conclusion. The Duke of Rothwell's wife, who was also the daughter of Eulalia Thorne, whose name was now on the coroner's record as it had always deserved to be, was one of theirs. The bells said so, ringing out over the June morning and the stone rooftops and the high street where the apothecary's shop stood with its lamp lit as it always was on a Tuesday. Because Tuesday was the day the shop was always open, and some things in Pendraven did not change.